everybody. Welcome to Good Tips for Hard Times, where we find smart people who have great advice to help you get through your days. Thank you so much for joining us. I don't know where you are in the world, but here in Los Angeles, it's a little bit of a dreary morning, and I'm kind of thankful for that. It's been really hot, and so, here we are. I might look a little darker than normal. Anyways, or the room lighting might look a little, wow. Just going to roll that one back. All right. I'm Anita Sarkeesian. I'm a media critic, public speaker, and the executive director of the Games and Online Harassment, which, as you know, is a new emotional resource for folks in the gaming community. And it's open. We have not streamed since it's been open. So we opened on Monday, and it is available Monday through Friday from 4 p.m. Pacific to 7 p.m. Pacific for folks in the U.S. So please spread the word. Tell all your friends, tell all your community folks that we are here for them. It's been a great first week. We're really excited about it. And thank you all for hanging in there while we got it up and going. I am really excited about our guest this week. We're going to be talking about accountability and inclusion and all kinds of fun stuff and important stuff in the tech industry, because games are part of the tech industry. And I think that this is a larger issue that we're seeing. So I would like to read this bio awkwardly. So one of Silicon Valley's leading advocates for inclusion and ethics in tech is Ellen Pao. Is also a longtime entrepreneur and investor. Her landmark gender discrimination case against venture capital firm Kleiner Perkins sparked other women, especially women of color, to fight harassment and discrimination in what's been called the Pao effect. Currently, Ellen is CEO of nonprofit Project Include, which uses data-based practical solutions and recommendations to give everyone a fair chance to succeed. At Reddit, she was the first major social platform CEO to ban revenge porn, unauthorized nude photos, and cross-platform harassment. Her book, Reset, recounts her longtime advocacy of diversity and inclusion and her own experiences with discrimination. Hi, Ellen.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, and congratulations on your launch.
Thank you. Sorry I butchered your bio, but we got there eventually. I remember when you started at Reddit, and we were all like, oh God, like, why would anyone take that job? Because it sounds atrocious, and is there anything to do? So I just, as I was reading that, remembering back to that moment of like, what a huge, massive undertaking in general.
Yeah, I have to tell you, like, when they asked me to resign, there was like a part of me that was just relieved, because I was like, oh my God, this is so much work, and it's just a grind every day. And people are so like unhappy with it, and they're not like, they're not seeing the big picture, and they're not seeing where this is going, but I know I have to do it. And then all of a sudden it was like gone, and I didn't have to do it, and I could just breathe again. But there's obviously also a part where I didn't get to finish the work, and I don't, and I wish I had been able to.
Yeah, of course. I feel like some of these companies or the structural platforms of these spaces are so massive that it's just so much work to come in and make a real difference there. And it's not just one person, right? There's so much that needs to get done. So many resources, so many people that allow change to happen to really start building in difference. And so, I think what you did there at least was like a good start for a really unfortunately toxic platform. But we're not here to talk about your experiences at Reddit. Although I think that all of what you've gone through and all of the different spaces you've inhabited and the work you've done is really empowers you to do this particular work with Project Include, right? That you're coming with such a wealth of experience and engagement in the tech industry in different sectors and different environments of it that can really inform how to make this place better. So do you want to talk a little bit about what Project Include is?
Yeah, sure. It started, there were like a bunch of people, like after I left Reddit, I took some time off, and then I started meeting with people, and we started talking about how tech was so broken. Like, there were a bunch of companies that were doing these bias trainings for 45 minutes, and then they do a big press release about how they are now this diverse and inclusive company because they did this 45-minute training. And we're just like, oh, this is so bad. And finally, a group of us got together, and we're just like, what would we actually think people what do we think people should actually do? And we came up with this list of 87 recommendations. We put it up on a website, and we, wanted to give people like the resources that I wish I had had when I was at Reddit, like, just experts talking about like the framework, how you should be thinking about it, and, what order you might want to do it in, and also kind of different options, and then different additional resources. So we threw that all on a website, and people liked it. So we ended up creating the nonprofit around that and starting to work with CEOs. So at that time, it was before a lot of the worker movements that are now powering a lot of change today. But back then, we're really thinking, it's the CEO who has to drive the change, right? If this change doesn't come from the CEO, it doesn't happen. And if diversity and inclusion isn't something that they understand and that they actually, have their hands on, it's just going to fail. So we work with CEOs in these small groups, and we survey all their employees to find out where the problems are and to give the CEO a better view of what they need to do. And then we have them talk amongst themselves to try to, give them like a high level CEO level conversation about like the decisions that they're making, the hard trade-offs. It's not easy. It is a lot of work, but just to give them comfort that they can have a place to talk about these things where, they can bounce ideas off at a high level and hopefully get some support and some advice that helps them accelerate the changes that they're working on.
That sounds great. It sounds really, I've said several times lately, as people have been talking a lot about accountability right now, especially in the games industry, about how, like, in my experience in the about 10 years that I've been doing this, if the leadership doesn't care, nothing changes. That if like the leadership either has to be like neutral or they have to actually care about these issues, because most of the time, and I imagine this is your experience as well, there are people within all of these companies who want to do better, right? Who want, and this could be anything from, more like straight up diversity and inclusion, but this could also, for me, was a lot around representation in games and what kinds of games studios were making. And if like the leadership didn't care, nothing got done ever. And I like that you brought up that there are these worker movements that are happening that are like pushing and forcing leadership to be accountable, whether they like it or not. And I hope we see a lot more of that. So let's like kind of break this down a little bit. Like when you talk about diversity and inclusion in tech, what does that mean?
So there are two parts of it. One is the diversity, which is like, hey, let's make sure that our company reflects the population. A lot of the tech industry and gaming companies too started with like a few guys in a room, came up with an idea and decided to start a product or a company around it, and then hired all of their friends who looked like them. And you end up with a very white male company. And that ends up proliferating throughout the whole startup. And then as it gets bigger, your leaders and your board members and, most of the people in power are these white men. Like, we're trying to get into startups earlier and say like, hey, if you have people from different backgrounds, you'll have a better sense of what your audience looks like. You'll have a better sense of problems that might come up. You're going to be a more fair company. And especially in this environment, I think all of the younger generation, most of them are actually looking to join a company that has some diversity, right? Even if they're not from an underrepresented group, they're like, I don't want to work with just the same people. I think the world should be diverse and inclusive, and I want to work at a company that looks like the world. And that has, and so companies have started to really focus on like, how do I get, more Black employees? How do I get more Latinx employees? How do I get more Indigenous employees? And how do I get more women? We're pushing like people should be looking at more non-binary people, but it's not just getting them in. The inclusion part is, how do I make sure that they're set up to succeed like everyone else? How do I make sure that my practices are fair, that I'm reviewing people fairly, that I'm paying people fairly, that I'm giving everybody the same opportunities, whether it's like a mentorship or, a work promotion or speaking at a conference. Like, how do I make sure that everybody is considered and not just the person that I know because we went to college together, or I know because we play golf together or whatever. It's just like, how do we make sure that talent is the thing that people are looking at and not these more biased characteristics.
Yeah, absolutely. That leads me to think about like, I feel like accountability is a really big piece of this, right? It's that, these companies were so putting aside like what to do as a starting up a new company, which I'm going to ask you in a little bit. But if you're an established company, right, and you probably had pretty bad practices when it came to diversity and inclusion, and maybe you're being called out right now for that. What does it mean to be accountable to that? What does that actually look like?
Oh, it's hard. I think the best way of having accountability is using metrics, right? So let me look at, how people are doing in terms of building their teams. Do they have people from different groups on their teams? And if they don't, I want to push them to do that. Maybe I'll set up targets, and it's not like I need to hire a Black person for this role, or I need to hire, a specific characteristic, but if I'm not hiring across my whole organization in a way that includes people in certain levels, then maybe I don't have a fair process. I think it is really hard because a lot of companies have been successful with these horrible practices, and it's hard for them to say, I got here from an unfair process. Like, I'm here with a successful company because I cheated and I cut out all these other people. It's hard to say that. It's hard to say, hey, I actually am somewhat racist and somewhat sexist.
Yeah. Yeah, I imagine so. And I feel like that's constantly a problem with talking about allyship and accountability for your own actions and your own responsibility to larger systemic issues. What the accountability question was coming up in my mind because, for example, this morning I saw a post on Twitter from I think her name was Priya from Bon Appetit. There was a big blow up that happened, and she and so I was thinking about this because and I don't know the whole story here. This is just a tiny bit, but Bon Appetit was accused of racist practices in terms of pay and labor exploitation, and they said we're going to do something about it, and months later they haven't. And so, thinking about what that means right now in the games industry, we're seeing a huge blow up with Blizzard and employees retaliating against extremely unfair labor practices and pay issues and pay disparity in a way that a lot of this is coming to the surface right now in this year, in this moment, which have been struggles that folks have been fighting for a long time. But the topic of accountability keeps coming up in these spaces, whether it is talking about like the larger Me Too movement that's happening with all of these folks coming forward about abuses in their workplaces, pay disparity. These are not separate from each other, right? These are not issues that are they're not separate from each other, right? Like if abuse is proliferating in a workplace, that's also probably because there's all of these other things that create this awful mechanism and awful structures inside. So thinking for me, I'm really excited about the work you're doing and what you're talking about, because it's like, what is real accountability? Like, you can't just make a statement that you support Black Lives Matter and then do nothing, right?
Yeah. I just saw people calling out a company for, pushing its vendors, the suppliers to be more diverse and inclusive. And then, worker movement example, the employees were like, hey, we're not diverse and inclusive. Why are we pushing our vendors? We need to make our company better before we can go call out our suppliers. I think there's a lot more of that where employees are willing to speak up and they're willing to say, hey, there's a problem here. We need to look inside. And, we're at Project Include, we're trying to encourage that, right? Like, companies feel good about themselves for doing not very much for their own employees. And that's the problem. Like, you keep pushing stuff out and you don't clean house. It just never gets done.
Yeah, totally. Someone in chat just asked if I said Blizzard is making change. I don't think I said that. I think I said Blizzard is being called out for what they're doing. just to clarify in case I did muck up those words. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And someone was talking about, someone recently reached out to me to ask me what I think about these companies that think that they're doing good but are actually the bad guys. Like they're having to reckon with the fact that like they are not good people in this equation. And I was like, that's an interesting way of putting this. So if like let's say someone who's watching this right now is starting up their own company, right? And they want to do this right. Like what's your like quick start guide? Like what's your like 3 tips to get going, or what advice would you give somebody?
I think it's like every hire is important, and like take the time to make sure that you're getting to the widest audience, right? Like it's so easy to just go and grab your friend or go and grab your friend's friend, and takes more time to say, okay, I need to make sure that I'm considering everyone. But when you do that, you get this huge flywheel effect of people wanting to work at a company where it's not like a group of people who started it from some elite small team that all knew each other. It's easier for people to join. It's easier for them to see themselves succeeding and staying there. So it's kind of like the first 5 people make a huge difference in a startup. Like they're the kind of founding team that, as a company grows, people will go back to them for advice. They'll go back to them. The stories that they tell will end up becoming, startup lore and set the values for the rest of the team for many years to come. So just make sure you get that right, and that you have some other perspectives and other backgrounds in that mix, so that you can, both make sure that you're doing the right things, but also make sure that you're set up to attract the right people.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, in your experience with working with CEOs, like, is there a particular, like, is there a experience or story that you can share? Like, is there something that is like the thing that just keeps getting caught up for folks, that like they just have the hardest time getting over certain hurdles? Like, are you seeing any patterns or trends there?
I think the thing that comes up the most is CEOs feeling uncomfortable talking about diversity and inclusion, feeling uncomfortable talking about race, especially if they're white men, which like the vast majority are. They don't want to say the wrong thing. They know they're not experts because they've lived, these lives of privilege. Their careers have been privileged. And they feel uncomfortable saying that they, believe in diversity and inclusion. They might not have the right words. They don't want to, I think part of it is be embarrassed by using the wrong term and getting called out for it, just like everybody else is. But to get them over that and help them understand, like, you don't have to be perfect if you want to talk about diversity and inclusion. It's okay to say you don't have all the answers in this area. And a lot of it is just people wanting to hear that it's important to you, and knowing that if they raise an issue at the top, the person actually cares about it, and hopefully it will end up being decided in the right way, instead of being brushed under the rug or, pushing the person who speaks up out of the company, which is what most companies do today.
Yeah. And it feels like if you're new to these topics and ideas, it's not going to be solved by one workshop one day at one company, right?
Right. It's a life of learning, right? It's a lifetime of learning, and things change. They're like the things that we've thought about in terms of language, in terms of policies, like it's evolving, and we're, continuing to learn as we go along. Oh, I need to plug in my Mac. I'm sorry.
That's okay. No problem. I will just fill up the time here. Oh, why do I hear an echo? Sorry, y'all. I think I'm going to mute that, and that'll solve that problem. Okay, 1 second. All right. Wait, I have you muted? Okay, you should be back.
All right.
Yeah, no problem. Live programming, everybody.
I'm prepared. Sorry.
That's okay.
I'm like, oh.
That's okay. We had a question in chat that I'm actually just going to summarize because and make a little more broad. So bear with me. Is there a role that consumers have or the public has in helping to encourage diverse and inclusive practices with the companies that they might buy products from or use products from?
I think a lot of these boycotts are actually quite effective. There's a part of companies that don't want to deal with this issue where the public shaming actually is the only thing that will actually work. The negative PR, the fear of um, being called racist or being perceived in that way, and then like their friends and family asking them like, what's actually going on here, why are you doing this? I think that puts a lot of pressure on them to change. So when when you're boycotting, whether it's H&M or um, Nike a while ago, like for their practices, it actually gets a message up to the highest levels in the company, even if the dollar amount isn't great. Like that negative publicity has a huge impact.
Yeah. And I want to add or sort of distinguish that like public shaming and boycotting, while are related, can also be separate.
Yeah.
I think your point of the negative publicity is good, but sometimes I think we get too caught up in like voting with your dollar, and that creates a sort of class distinction of like the people with the most money then get to make a decision as to what is valuable. But that like, how do we like the public shaming of these companies, as you're saying, like they respond to that, right? Yeah. Anything that's going to hurt their reputation, that's going to hurt their dollar, like, their dollar value is really, they hear that. Which is why I think the accountability piece is so important here, because like if they capitulate to the public cries of shame, like how do we actually keep that energy alive to be like, okay, well, cool, you have 6 months, right? And then 6 months everyone forgets. So what does it mean to actually like follow up and be like, okay, like, because crisis PR, here's a secret, everybody. Crisis PR is all about just like, maybe don't say anything and just let it disappear, right? Or say something and let it disappear. And so how do we, well, actually, this is beyond the scope of our conversation, but like, how do we as the public keep that momentum going and being like, okay, what have you done? Like all of these companies that made all of these statements about Black Lives Matter and changing hiring practices and donating money into communities, like, how do we follow up with all of that and make sure that they're all doing that work?
It's hard. I went to give a talk someplace and they're like, okay, we're going to buy 200 of your books. And then they never did. And I never followed up with them because it's like, it's exhausting, right? Like, why am I keeping track of your promises and the work that you're not doing?
Yeah, it's just more labor for us.
Yeah. So I don't have a good answer for that. Yeah. I'm like, it's like you hope then that you're looking at the leadership, right? So, if I, buy something from Trader Joe's, I'm pretty sure it's like well maintained and it's, well selected, and it's, they're not selling me like expired goods, because I trust in their leadership. I trust in their history of what they've done. And so it's hard to say like, oh, this leader who's done such terrible things for the past 2 decades is all of a sudden going to change because they've made a statement. So part of it is trying to find these organizations and these companies that you actually believe in because they've been doing the right thing. So, for a long time, and then trying to wait and see with these other organizations before you give them your money and before you give them your support.
Yeah. I was thinking about like, well, is it the workers then in those environments that are there day to day being affected by this? But then, like that's just more unpaid labor that the workers have to do in those spaces too, right? Like I'm tired.
And Priya from Bon Appetit, she quit, right? Yeah. Like she quit, and that's how she made her statement. It's like, you told me things were going to change, so I stayed, and now I'm trying to hold you accountable and you're not. So my only recourse now is to leave and to do it publicly and to do the public shaming. That seems to be the only thing that works on people. And even that first public shaming wasn't enough. Yeah,
absolutely. I think about I'm thinking a little bit, slightly different topic, but related, about the difference between, I'm thinking about like social media platforms, right? That is a type of tech, right? And when we talk about tech, we're talking about like a broad range of products. And so I think that social media companies have their own specific, unique problems in terms of like community and online harassment and like public engagement. And, are you seeing like, can you speak to that? Are you seeing? Yes. I don't know how to finish that question.
It does feel much more unwieldy now. Like when I was at Reddit, we took down a bunch of content and we knew, oh, it's only about like 15,000 people are actually posting on these sites. And if we can manage like 100 of them who are kind of the leaders of those subreddits, then we can control it. And now it feels like that bad behavior is standard. That and it used to be like the bad actors were trying to keep other people quiet, and a lot of it was keeping people from underrepresented groups, like basically based on race and gender. And now it's like everybody's just yelling at each other, right? Like that has become the way to interact. It's, people are realizing I get attention, I get engagement. And if I get kicked off, I get even more attention because all of a sudden I get all this press coverage and now people know how to find me. I think it's harder because there's like people aren't given an alternative, right? And these platforms are looking for engagement, like they're run as businesses measured on engagement, and they need to keep that engagement going. So they need to encourage like people to have these, to have these silos where they clash with each other, because that drives a ton of people to come watch and to get involved and to bring their friends in and to create more of a spectacle that people are attracted to. And the spectacles get bigger and bigger because people get more used to that increasing level of toxicity.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's difficult because these platforms were built without any care or effort into what kinds of harms or safety issues are a concern. And so like trying to fix them is like throwing Band-Aids on top of them. And then you get more and more platforms as like the new ones rise up, like, Instagram's not new anymore, but like it was Instagram and then Snapchat and then Instagram. I don't remember the order of that. And then like TikTok, like it still feels like they're not doing the work to like build in safety tools. And I'm like, how long is it going to take until you understand that this is actually, you've got to build it from the ground up into your platforms.
And a big part of it is I don't think there are really like women or people of color driving, or people from underrepresented races and ethnicities driving changes. Right. Yeah. Making decisions and being able to say, hey, this feature isn't going to work, or hey, this is really disproportionately hurting, the transgender people on your platform, or like these problems are coming up because nobody from management is experiencing them and thinking about it before they get built in. And then all of a sudden it scales and it's driving engagement and they don't want to get rid of it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a question I want to pop in to chat. See if this makes sense to you. It's from It's Scully, asking, how can non-managerial workers chip away at managers' beliefs that trying to hire with diversity in mind is discriminatory?
Oh God, it's hard because some people will not change. Like for some people, it's like so you have to figure out, is this person like building a brand on like being, the person who always has a devil's advocate voice in these meetings talking about diversity and inclusion, who always has kind of a quick argument that, that we should be looking at everything, that we should be colorblind and gender blind. Is this person like purposely difficult, and have they built their identity around it? So you would really need to go in and figure out how to break down their psychology to change it. Or are they just somewhat ignorant, and you can share stories and you can have other people share stories. You can give them a book and maybe they can understand things, or, try to build, is there some core of empathy in them that can help understand it, so that you can give examples that will actually activate some kind of change? Or is it like a lost cause? And a lot of people, like it's not like you can tell one story and they're going to change. I think like after I sued Kleiner, it took like 5 years before people really were like, oh, that actually was a good thing, and I shouldn't have called you stupid and all those horrible names that I called you. You are actually doing something good. Like it's different for different people, but somebody, when I was trying to get Reddit onto mobile, somebody was like, it's going to take 7 times. You have to mention it 7 times in 7 different ways before it actually sinks into somebody's head. So, hopefully, you can find somebody who, if your manager wants to change, you can just give an example every week of, you know, what you're talking about, and that will change. If it's examples within the office, like you can bring up a problem, but give 3 examples. Often, we deal with so much and it's ongoing that we'll bring up like one example because it's like the straw that breaks the camel's back. And we're just like, they made me get coffee and I'm just sick of it. But then it'll go like, well, you just had to get coffee once. But if you bring in the example, like, and I had to do and I had to take notes for these 5 meetings and I had to get coffee these 3 other times. And I had to, like, you show the pattern, it helps people understand it a little better because they don't want to understand it, right? They want it to be something small that they can, erase. But when you come up and you have like this bigger problem and you have all these examples, then they actually should want to address it.
Yeah, patterns. I think that's really good advice. I found that one of the reasons I think tropes versus women in video games really hit was because we were like, here's the problem, and here are 50 examples of the problem, right? Where I'm like, you probably played all of these games and you didn't notice it until they're literally back to back. And we used video editing techniques of like laying them all out to be like, here's the problem. And it's really hard to refute that. Like, I think that goes back to the point you're making about like, are they compassionate or empathetic about it? Or are they just like, don't care? Because if you can show them data and evidence and patterns and they're still just like, whatever, what do you do then? So I think, I'm glad you brought up that. I wanted to, if I can bring up just sort of loosely. So you sued Kleiner Perkins for gender discrimination. You got a world of shit for it because it was one of the first, or like it was a very, very public lawsuit. And it really felt like you were kind of out there on a limb by yourself in a lot of ways, like the sort of commending the courage to actually do that. Are you finding that there are more people who are, you were saying that people look back at that moment and see the bravery and see the courage, but that they didn't think that at the time, right? Are you seeing a different landscape or environment for people coming into these fields today, or coming into like having conversations about these issues today?
Oh, it's a good question. I think it's changed. I do think like if some of the things happen today that I mentioned, like they would be dealt with better. I don't think the fundamental systemic problems have changed. Like if you look at VC firms, they're still overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male. Like I don't have the statistics on me, but it's like, you can just look at the numbers. So that hasn't really changed. And then if you look at who gets invested in, who the founders are that get investment dollars, it's still very white. It's still very male. Even like these new funds run by women and people of color are still part of the system, right? Because this is what gets funded at the higher, at the bigger dollar levels that don't have as many new people breaking into. So it's like the system is still super, super rigid, and it's hard to change. But I do think like the individual employee stories are getting, are easier for people to tell because, when I told mine, everybody was like, she's crazy. She's just crazy. I mean, somebody actually wrote a whole piece about how they thought I was crazy. And I think there's less of that. Like, I think there is an understanding that there is a lot of bias in tech, in gaming, in the VC world, and that's kind of a given now. But I don't know that they've really figured out how to get around it and how to get rid of it. I think there are some companies that I like that are thinking about it and doing better at it. I think, companies are now hiring diversity and inclusion specialists who are often from from different backgrounds, and that adds like a higher level perspective. For a long time, it was just your diversity and inclusion specialist was your recruiter, your college recruiter who was probably 2 years out of school themselves. So now you've got experts who have experience, who have management experience, who understand how like companies operate, and who have a much bigger voice and can hopefully help effectuate change. But it's still really slow. I was such a fan of Pinterest, and then those two women came out and were just like, no, it's also problematic. And you're just like, wow. So there really are very few companies that are actually getting it right, or even close to right.
Yeah, it makes me think of the old adage, this is why we can't have nice things.
Yeah.
You know? There are many of us who are very suspicious of just like all companies in general, because there's, even the good guys aren't the good guys, that sort of idea. I think, I feel like I have more thoughts around that I'm stalling on. I feel like there is a sense of, like the system, like what I'm not saying is that the system of capitalism has particular structures that are in place that make it very hard to do good. And that you have to fight extremely hard and have to be really dedicated and focused to even have an inkling of some kind of semblance of like humanity based in a workplace under these particular systems. And I think that's what we're fighting against. There's a question in chat related to what we were speaking about before that I thought was interesting. Anna G asks, how do you document and gather evidence and then present the pattern without coming across as adversarial? I think one of the things that you had mentioned is this idea of like, or I imagined you mentioning this because I was thinking it, is that you kind of get siloed as the person in the workplace, that like the annoying feminist or the annoying person always talking about race. Have you seen strategies that are a little more palatable to leadership?
At the end, it just depends. Like, do they want the feedback or not? Right? If they don't want the feedback, then you are the annoying person and you're not a culture fit, right? Like you're antagonistic. You don't want to play. You're not a team player if you're bringing these things up. You're out of the loop, and then eventually it shows up on your reviews, and you get pushed out. But I think if it's, if your leader actually cares, like they should, I'd much rather have the early indication that there's a huge problem and prevent it from becoming a bigger problem than wait until like, everybody's ready to quit, or, writing a public petition to get me fired. Right. Like, but it's hard. Like, I don't know that many leaders are that comfortable with it. So it's hard to know what the right way of going about it is. I do think like coming in, not being super emotional, but sometimes people need the emotion, right? Because it gives them like, it seems more, they feel more empathetic if you're emotional. So I think it depends on the individual, but for your own good, like just write it all down. Like there will be gaslighting in most organizations. Like that is what people will do. They're trying to brush it away. They're trying to explain it. And if you have it down, at least know that you're right inside, and that will help you get through a lot. Like you just know that you're right regardless of what they say. And, but it's hard. Like, it's interesting just hearing you talk about like, tech thinks of itself as being like this broad-minded, super innovative, open mindset, area. But when it comes to these issues, like it's just so fixed mindset. People can't change their minds, and they can't come up with new ways of doing things. And it's so disappointing. And you see people where they're like these great leaders and they do such a terrible job on diversity and inclusion. You really think like, are they really that good at leading, or were they just lucky?
Yeah, absolutely. Your description of tech, I was sort of giggling to myself about, because I think that we've seen, and I've seen specifically in the games industry, but also in tech more broadly, of like folks really thought of themselves as like liberal and progressive. And then they were introduced to ideas of like anti-sexism and anti-racism and anti-homophobia. And like, and they're pushed back so hard. And you're just like, yeah, what values do you hold? Right? Like, why do you think of yourself as, just because you're like not anti-abortion? I don't know. Like the ways that we think about or have historically thought about the political spectrum, at least in the US, is so limited that I think a lot of these sort of tech company dudes really did think they're like, we're starting this platform, freedom of speech, everyone gets a say, and they didn't understand how they're reproducing a lot of the same systemic oppression that exists in that they were probably perpetuating in their life, not because you're like bad people, but because that's the way that our society is built right now. And so I think that a lot of these issues coming out are really jarring for people who have this self-identity as liberal and progressive, and they're not. They're really not. Which, yeah.
It's interesting because when Ev Williams came out, I think in the New York Times, and said, "Oh, I actually think that we didn't know what we're doing." I don't think he said it that directly, but that we thought that we build this open platform and it'd be all good, and actually there's so many problems with it, and maybe we shouldn't have done it that way. Like that was like radical and new, and not. And I think maybe Dick Costolo has said there's been a lot of harassment. Some memo leaked, but you don't see it from that many others. I think the 8chan founder and then the 4chan guy sold, but you don't see people on Facebook. You see one board member and maybe a couple of lower level employees, but like where are they saying like, hey, we didn't mean to create genocide in Myanmar and we're sorry, and there was a fundamental problem with our platform and we need to go and fix it, right? Like we thought it was going to be something different, and this is clearly a mistake. But no, it's like always a rationale, always the gaslighting, always this is a bug, not a feature, but it's like a small bug compared to the great good that we're doing elsewhere.
Yeah.
They just can't process it. Like that mindset is so fixed. They just can't process that they're actually doing active harm. And you still see, I've been blocked on Twitter by so many of these people who are like free speechy. And I'm just like, it's free speech until it comes to being criticized for, being part of the systemic problem. And I don't even criticize them by name, I don't think, right? It's just like, they don't want to hear it.
Fun little aside, I did a talk in 2014 and the founder of 4chan was in the audience, and I had no idea at the time, and I was totally talking shit about 4chan, as I should be. And it was just funny because when I got off stage, someone was like, hey, did you know that such and such is here? And I was like, Christopher Poole, Moot. And I was like, nope. I hope he heard some of that. So that was my fun little addition to that. I kind of, to wrap up some of this, I want to acknowledge that like change is hard, and especially progressive change that's fighting for liberation, for humanity, for whether it's worker rights or racial justice, environmental justice. Like these have for centuries have been really activists have been working on these issues for a very long time and will continue to do so. And the progress and the change that we see is because people have been working for a very long time to get there. And in this moment is a part of that ongoing work. And so not that I'm one to be like, let's end on a hopeful note at all, because I'm not that person. But I do think that understanding that we have to do the work, we have to be a part of the struggle and a part of the fight and keep pushing, because I get asked all the time, is it getting better? Is it getting better? Is the games industry getting better? And I just like, I know why that question is asked, and I understand it, but it's like yes and no at the same time. And I think that that's what progress looks like. And so understanding that there are lots of different strategies and tools and tactics that people are going to use, and we need a lot of them. Some of them I don't agree with, but we need a lot of them to be able to create real change from all different levels of the work that we're doing. And so whether it's actually like making more equitable workplaces, whether it is like, marching in the streets, I think there's a lot of different ways to for folks to get involved and to do this work and to focus on making real change.
Yeah, I think that's right. I do feel like it is slightly different. Like you can't unsee what we saw, that the fact that there is this police brutality and that they respond to protests against it with more police brutality. Like it's hard to unsee that, and it's hard to unsee the racism behind it. And I do think the Me Too movement, like the second wave, has been incredibly impactful. Like you can't unsee, all of the harm that's happened, and the fact that people are more comfortable telling their stories is hugely powerful. And the fact that I can still work in this industry, right? Like I was kind of not for a while, but but I did get some opportunities to do some work even after suing, one of the leading venture capital firms in the industry. So I do think that like people are getting like that they're now acclimated to the fact that there is, it's the first time people like broadly are calling it systemic racism, systemic sexism, right? That there is a systemic problem, right? So that's a huge change.
I remember after Trump got elected, I was listening to the radio and like, it was just, I don't know, I was like flipping through the channels in a car or something. And like some average radio, like DJ said the word white supremacy. And I was like, what? We can say that now? We can actually use the words that like describe the thing in the mainstream? It was this moment. And I'm like, yeah, there's something very powerful to the fact that like we can use those words and not be immediately dismissed anymore, right? As like wildly radical and over the top and extreme and all that. Like, no, the problem is this bad and it's this big and we need everyone to really be a part of creating real change. And that's going to be hard and it's going to be uncomfortable. And people are going to have to admit that they've caused harm in this process, So cool. Well, this was a delightful conversation. I think about this stuff a lot. It's really nice to chat with you about this and hear more about Project Include and, different ways of approaching this very large juggernaut of an issue. So if folks want to learn more about you, what you've done, check out your book, how might they do all of these things?
So my book is on sale wherever you can buy books. And I am EKP on Twitter. And the Project Include website is projectinclude.org.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Ellen.
Thank you for having me. This was great. I enjoyed it.
Thank you all for joining us for this delightful conversation on this Thursday morning Pacific time. I want to thank all the mods for keeping this space friendly. I want to thank all of you for tuning in with all of your lovely comments and discussion in the chat. If you want to watch this video or any of our Good Tips for Hard Times videos, you can do that at the Games Hotline YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/gameshotline. Just want to remind you all that the hotline is actually open. It is available from Monday through Friday from 4 p.m. Pacific to 7 p.m. Pacific. And you can find out more about that at gameshotline.org. Please help us spread the word in all of your communities. You can retweet our announcements from the Games Hotline Twitter account or anywhere. We're on all the things at Games Hotline. You can see that just right there. No, there, right there on the bottom of your screen. And also, the hotline is free, and we want to keep it that way. So if you can, please head over to gameshotline.org/donate and share a few bucks to help us keep it going. All right, so join us next week when my colleague Jay will be talking to Chad Moses from To Write Love on Her Arms about finding the right therapist for you, because that can be a really tricky thing to do, and I'm really looking forward to that discussion. So we'll see you all next week. Bye.